everybody. My name is Temblador. Thank you for coming out tonight for LitTalk at Whose Books. Our first LitTalk at Whose Books. Thanks for having us. I am the mind behind LitTalk. We are in partnership with Writing Workshops Dallas, with the Writers Garrett, and I'm excited to be here tonight with 3 DFW-based authors talking about how creative writing can reflect the larger issues of society. And I'm going to introduce these 3 amazing writers with a little bio. So at the end we have Logan Keir, who is a queer poet and professor. She curates Inner Moonlight, the monthly podcast reading series at the Wild Detectives. She's an editor for Voicemail Poems and earned her MFA in creative writing from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Her debut full-length poetry collection, Welcome to Midland, was shortlisted for the Reading the West Book Awards, and it's available here at Whose Books. Thanks for being here, Logan.
Thank you.
Next to Logan, we have Tarfia Fazula, who is the author of 2 poetry collections, Seam and Registers of Illuminated Villages. Her poems have appeared widely both here and abroad and have been translated into several languages. In 2016, Tarfia was recognized by Harvard Law School as one of 50 women inspiring change. Thanks for being here, Tarfia. And then here we have Daniel Peña, one of the newest writers to DFW. He is a Pushcart Prize-winning writer and assistant professor at the University of North Texas, formerly based out of UNAM in Mexico City, where he worked as a Fulbright-Garcia Robles Scholar, a graduate of Cornell University, and a former Picador Guest Professor in
Leipzig.
Leipzig.
Yeah.
Germany. His writing has appeared in Ploughshares, the Rumpus, Kenyon Review, Texas Monthly, NBC News, and the New York Times Magazine. He's currently a regular contributor to The Guardian and Ploughshares blog. His novel Bang is out now from Arte Publico Press, and he lives in Dallas-Fort Worth.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. So, I was interested in this idea because my second book, Half Outlaw, came out this year, and I know that I wrote the book with a lot of kind of intentions of social issues that are happening in society and things I wanted to highlight. Yeah, no worries, come on in. Yeah. And so I'm curious, have any of you written, whether it's a poem, whether it's a short story or a novel, have you written with the idea of like, I want to create a change, whether that's on a large scale, small scale? Have you ever had that intention with any of your writings? This is open to anybody. I'm going to point at you first. Go
Okay,
ahead.
yeah. No, I think about this a lot. This is a conversation I have with my students and who are writers that, we our job as writers, sometimes when we're creating, what separates sort of like, propaganda from literature? And I think literature is we're sort of examining the human condition. And so, I'm always wary of sort of even when I'm diving into spaces where I'm like, oh man, I want to be a catalyst for change, or I want to articulate something that maybe hasn't been articulated yet about a specific subject. I sometimes waffle between like, is this a nonfiction piece? Is this something I say directly as Daniel Peña, or is this something I say in maybe a short story or novel or something?
Through a character or storyline.
Yeah, but for me, anytime I'm working in the realm of fiction, I'm always boiling it down into, how does this manifest within a character, right? And I think that's sort of when we're falling into the good kind of trouble with fiction is that we're sort of going away from propaganda and we're looking in deep into, and I say propaganda in sort of very cosmopolitan term. I don't mean it pejoratively, but I mean it in a sort of like, how is it that we're manifesting this in a human level? What does it mean for that one character in this one specific set of circumstances? And I think that's ultimately the more powerful tool in a lot of instances.
Yeah. I agree, because I feel like if I'm seeing myself in that character thinking or doing or going through whatever journey they're going through, it speaks louder to me.
Yeah.
How about y'all? Do you write with the intention of hopefully affecting change, or do you write something and it comes out like, oh, it just happens to have these major topics of discussion that's going on in our world?
I think it depends what you mean by affect change, because I don't guess I had an intention in writing Welcome to Midland. I wanted to write the book that would have changed my life when I was young. And the young protagonist in the book is, like, I intentionally framed that protagonist as heroic, somebody that we're all, like, rooting for. And I don't think that creates large-scale change or alters the oppressive culture that we live in huge ways, right? But I do think that I've had that intention of creating change for a very specific audience. I feel like I've received messages and stuff since the book has come out from folks who are from small conservative places, queer folks who've said this resonated with me. So I have that, like, some evidence anyway that I succeeded in, like, that small change-making goal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. I mean, I don't think, change has to be I mean, as much as I would hope my book created a new law for something, or like repealed a law or something in Texas, I don't know if that's gonna happen, but even in small ways. Do you approach it in small or big or kind of both, or not at all, Tarkia?
I'm kind of suspicious of change, maybe I don't believe in it, but I also don't think that what I do or don't believe in causes a thing to exist. So I know that change is kind of an active thing. It's sort of part of the human experience. Like, I'm always really amazed by how technically on a cellular level you're a different person every 7 years, and that seems really wild to me. So I think I experience change as just sort of like a natural phenomenon of things, but I do think that language can create a window that sort of can allow you to see things differently, maybe. And I agree with both Daniel and Logan that it's not necessarily about a huge, drastic, impact, but sort of those minute choices about, genre change, or like how you say the thing that will allow the connection, that will allow the, maybe like action that needs to happen from the connection.
Yeah.
That I believe in as a process. Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. I like what you brought up about genre because you and Logan both write poetry. Do you think that poetry can speak to like social issues or that call to action or something in a way that prose can't do, or does it have its like an avenue of like explaining things in a different way that maybe is more receptive to some people in certain ways, just because of its form?
How about you?
Yeah. People use poetry to mark moments. And poetry is often what people turn to in crisis. So yes, I think poetry has a particular unique power that is only possible in poetry. I don't think that other forms of literature are like more or less probably, right? But I do think there is that unique quality to poetry, that I think it connects more directly with people's like subconscious and emotions. I think it's sort of counterintuitive that it's like this sort of feat of language that elicits things in people that they cannot put language to themselves.
Yeah. But you see, and you know what it is when you read it. But
yes.
Yeah.
I like the marking moment thing. I agree with that. Like, there's a way that poetry can handle time. I think like through compression, but also I think, I was just thinking that you don't really hear about people being asked to read essays at weddings or funerals. Like, but people are kind of like asked to read poems or kind of share poems. And so I think that there's like a way that it kind of like can contain like a kind of like, metaphysical grief, even like something that is sort of like wordless because it relies like on silence more, that I think like makes it feel like a very kind of like it's kind of, and I also think about how it approaches or can approach things like slogans or like chanting or mantras. Like, it's connected to all of these different like
bite-sized things that we hold up.
and it's a form available to the illiterate. You don't have to, like I think that part of it makes it valuable.
Yeah, I mean, and we know it's so much more shareable on like social media than a novel or a short story is. Like we're putting it out on Instagram, and we're seeing people respond to them and stuff like that, or on Twitter if you're doing a small poem. Yeah. Daniel, you have a new book that you're working on. How to Look Away, The Ritual of Trauma Consumption and Why We Need It.
Yeah.
And so it's a mix of memoir and reporting on the cultural issue of the white gaze, America's obsession with the drug cartel and border politics. And you've written about border politics in Bang. How do you feel like your approach with like creative nonfiction will be different on those topics will be different than your fiction?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, for me, my creative nonfiction is like, you ever go to the grocery store or something and you like bring home a bunch of ingredients. That's like what you have to cook with. You can't really like whatever you brought home is what you got.
Yeah.
And that's kind of nonfiction is like, the truth is the truth.
Yeah.
And I sort of subscribe to this very Mary Carr version of that idea, which is like, you can't make anything up from whole cloth. And what I found is that, I mean, creative nonfiction is kind of a departure for me, What I found is that when you dig deep enough, the truth is actually so much weirder than anything I can make up.
Oh yeah.
So it's so much more gratifying in a way. Like I have a piece out this month in Ploughshares that it was, I don't know if I'm, well, it's in the book, so I'll talk about it, but it's essentially I was there to profile in a very sort of rudimentary way this guy who was trying to reunite with his son, and he was deported from Georgia. And as I was writing it, his girlfriend was murdered. It was a high-profile cartel murder in Mexico that gripped the country. And it's one of those things where you're just like, the details around it were so much weirder than anything I could articulate in fiction. And as you dug deeper and deeper into the story, it just got weirder and weirder. And ultimately, that's kind of was the genesis of that book, was like looking at the commissioning editor who really needed the details of the piece and asking like, why do you need the murder scene? Why I was glossing over it because it was frankly the least interesting part of the piece, but she was really drilling down, like, show me the scene. I visited the scene, I didn't see the body or anything, but I was like, why do you need that?
Yeah.
And how much money are you gonna monetize these clips for?
And this is
like
what you're talking about in this book about like the white gaze of drug cartel.
Yeah, and it was
the obsession with drug cartel.
Yeah, and so I ended up scrapping it. I pulled it and then I turned it into a creative nonfiction piece. That, I mean, the spoiler alert is that I inverted it and I asked the readers, like, the entire narrative momentum has been building up to the scene. But why do we crave it? When we pass a car wreck, why does everyone slow down? That kind of thing. But I think it has something to do with we don't want it to happen to us, but I also think that there's a fear that other people's misfortune is contagious. Yeah. And so there's a kind of ritual consumption of it. But it was weird, but that's something that like Bang is mostly based on real events. That's the claim to fame for that. But like I couldn't make anything up that weird. It happens. It was a freak accident. The freak thing that happened while I was doing
coincidence, crazy coincidence, but also like
traumatic
event that unless you're a murderous person, you could never think of that stuff.
But it peeled back the layer behind all this other deeper stuff where the story was going one direction, was about father and son, and then it opened up to this huge aperture, which is that there's a truth that most everyone in Mexico has been touched by the drug war.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and I've read Bang, and it's
intense.
It's intense. Yeah.
It took years off my life to write it.
I can see that, having read it.
Yeah.
Oh man, it's hard. But I mean, you're not the only writer who's written some difficult stuff here. I know that Tarfia, when you wrote Scene, you went to Bangladesh to write about the 200,000 female victims of rape and torture at the hands of the Pakistani army in the 1971 Liberation War. What made you feel called to like go to Bangladesh to speak to these women, to tell their stories and your story that's woven within your poetry collection?
Yeah. Well, my family is Bangladeshi. well. And then I heard about this phenomenon of so many women being, treated as sex slaves or raped, much like the comfort women, but that of course I wasn't hearing anybody talk about it at all. Least of all, of course, other Bangladeshis. And so I guess I just got kind of intrigued, and I think also I was thinking, I just couldn't stop thinking about the inner lives of abused women. And so I wrote some poems from my imagination, and then it started to feel, I hit an ethical wall. Like I was just sort of like, how much am I allowed to sort of like embody this perspective, having not experienced it at all? So, and then I applied for a Fulbright, and then I got it, which was like the most shocking, and then I was like, oh crap, and
You're like, I won't get
and then I was like, now I have to, exactly, it's fine, but we're gonna have to
Yeah.
write these poems again.
Yeah.
But then I actually got it, much to my horror, and then I actually had to like go through it and actually do the thing that I said I was gonna do, which is difficult for me every day, and some days more than others. But I really felt sort of like terrified of what was gonna happen. But what did end up happening is that I, was sort of like, I don't want to say welcomed, because that's not exactly how it was, because on a Fulbright you're sort of like almost like parachuted into wherever, and then sort of left your own devices to figure out how to manifest the project that you said you were going to do.
Yeah.
So I kind of was just like, I started just asking around about it and talking to different people about it, and then one person would connect me to another person who had a story to tell, and then another person who knew a survivor, and then I ended up meeting a woman who she was a freedom fighter during the war, and she ran like kind of like a retreat or sort of like halfway home for women who had gone through that, and so she allowed me to come and spend some time with them. And a lot of the poems about them, specifically from their perspective, came from some of those conversations. But yeah, I guess like you asked why I was called, and I'm still not sure, except that I think like a lot of writing comes from obsession,
Yeah.
And I think like I just couldn't stop thinking about it, and I couldn't stop talking about it, and then.
Do you think like this, because I know both you and Daniel have written about kind of like big traumatic experiences and like events that happened in Mexico and Bangladesh. Is it that idea of like, if we can write about it creatively, then maybe we'll teach people, or either examine what we've done, or like help people like on a path in the future, or create awareness? What do you think it is about these historical events?
Yeah.
No.
I think for me in fiction and nonfiction, there are two different things. For me in fiction, I always tell my students, is like, for like the example, like The Lion King, is that like we like The Lion King because we like shows about lions that are kings?
Yeah.
And we like it because we want Simba. And so for me, the characters are really of the essence there, where I'm like, the way in which they change from the beginning to the piece to the end, it's interesting to me. And with that book, it was really like looking at the way in which the drug war and neoliberal economic policy like NAFTA, and America's immigration policy were like all just sort of reinforcing each other.
Yeah.
And how that the driving question was, what happens to the people we deport, and basically like, is this, if by accident, what does it say about us that we continue dumping money into these broken systems? And if by design, what does it mean that we're disposing of people in this way and feeding into this drug war? So for me, I was interested in the way in which characters were operating within those mechanizations, and it was a unpacking of that. For my nonfiction, so much of it is like really trying to almost like reverse looking at the ways in which these characters, are sort of part and parcel of these macro forces, but the macro forces are almost part of the story, and that's for me, it's a meditation on like what is this, right? It's almost like a yin and yang situation.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I answered that question.
Yeah. It sounds good to me. Yeah. Logan, you're welcome to Midlands speaks to your experience growing up queer in conservative West Texas. You kind of talked about earlier, like, writing this book helps. Did it help, like, people who have, like, given you feedback, it has helped them in different ways? How did writing this book, like, change your life? And is there something to be said of just, like, creative writing just changing at least one person's life, just the authors, if not, and, like, yay if it does somebody else's, but also just the writer themselves?
Yeah, I think we're all drawn to write because we have had life-changing experiences with literature.
Yeah.
And I think, for me anyway, I'm a project writer. I write books.
So you focus on the big project, it's not like just one poem here, there,
Yes. And I had some particular things I wanted to do with my poetic voice for this book. I wanted there to be a heroic protagonist. The voice in my poems had been pretty villainous prior. It was a very different, darker voice. Yes. I wanted these poems to be more embodied. The previous voice in my poems was really just a voice. Just this sort of dark, villainous voice that implicated you. And the voice could sort of talk about the bodies of other folks, but it was not the body of the self.
Okay.
So I was trying to figure that out. How do I do that? And I wanted to turn my poetic eye to things like nature and historical events and weather and things that were going to build the narrative, but not necessarily poems that are like part of a story explicitly, right? So both of those things are happening in the book. There is a story, there's like a narrative that centers on the protagonist, but the other things that are happening in the book are wild animals and weird historical events and that kind of stuff. And that was totally different for me as a writer. I had not really ever been a nature poet. Love me some Mary Oliver, but had never tried, right?
Yeah.
So that was different and new, and it made me research all kinds of different things that I had not engaged with before. And I think I've talked about this with you before, but part of the process for me as a writer, this book taught me that there is no universal audience, that I can liberate myself from that abstraction, that does not exist, that that's not serving my writing, that's not serving readers to imagine that you can like appeal to a universal audience, because that's like code for like white cis mainstream. And writing this book freed me from that, and that is probably the biggest thing that writing this book did for me, is that I am liberated from that. I am changed.
I love that. I like that. The other day me and Tarfia were having a conversation with Erin of the Writers Garret, and we were talking about, what we think, whether it's magazines, it's publishers, it's readers, do you think they are, and I'm kind of like changing this up a bit from what we were talking about, do you think people are pushing back from books that have concepts of like, or discussions about social issues? Do you think they are wanting it? Whether it's like publishers, magazines, or readers, how do you think, or within your own genres, how do you feel like people are reacting, or what you're hearing? Or even, you also teach, do you feel like students are interested in that?
I feel like I'm taking up so much space, but I generally feel like it's gotten better than it used to be even 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I think a lot of it is sort of like driven from some of the social movements, some of the change we've had at BLM movement, for instance, in the past years. I do find, though, something troubling I do find about publishing now, though, is that going back to this idea of like propaganda, which is ultimately I feel like not character driven. It's idea driven, and it's like the idea is that there's some deliverable at the end of it, and it's. I think we have to be wary of. Like Zizek has this idea of like greenwashing, where he's like, I can buy the Starbucks coffee, and it was economically sustainable, and so I can say I'm not part of climate change or whatever.
Yeah.
By buying that Starbucks coffee. I think what we're seeing is a trend in publishing where people are like kind of like I don't know that version of greenwashing, but there is a real push. And it's a conversation I've had with my agent, and she's great. I love my agent. When I sold this last book, that I was like I don't want it to be that kind of book.
Yeah.
That I don't want it to be sort of like in the realm of like propaganda or something sort of cheap, easy book deal.
Yeah.
It has to be really substantive, and it has to be character driven. But I do fear for like some of the pressures that publishers are putting on writers right now to create certain kinds of books. But that ultimately I would argue don't serve our literary canons, and in fact they warp on a little bit.
Yeah. I get what you mean.
Yeah.
How do y'all feel?
I don't know, because I feel sort of like I kind of purposefully try to check out from trends or anticipating trends or what the hottest, like I think like that stuff is not interesting to me.
Yeah.
So I don't pay attention to it, and also I think like I'm not trying to chase any, like I just think like you can, you write the books that you can write, and you focus on that, and you're good to the people who you can be good to within, and like I think like you ideally, if you have a solid publisher, like I think like those movements will sort of happen whether you force them to or not. Like I think like obviously, what maybe makes us, and I say us broadly, like different though from like previous iterations of social media, where you can kind of like self-commodify, you can like kind of like wokeness is now kind of a commodity. Like it's like there's nothing is really sacred. I saw a great thread on Twitter not long ago that was sort of basically like, the myth of thinking that you're a radical, that you can like still maintain sort of like a kind of radical position inside academia, for example. And like, so I think like there are kind of always complex conversations happening about whether or not, like what we kind of broadly trendily call wokeness now is sort of like at play or not. But the truth is it's always been like if you look at literary movements from before, like this is why I say I'm not really sure if I believe in change, because we've seen like different rises and falls of different, literary canons, and so I think like there's always art being made everywhere in the world. There's a mainstream stage, and that mainstream stage seems like it's the one responsible for all the decisions and what people are reading. But the truth is, all sorts of art is always being made and always being consumed. So I don't know. Yeah. That was a big long blah, but like hopefully some parts stuck. Yeah.
I mean, I think even Logan, you have a cool platform in Inner Moonlight to see like when people who are not the intended like writer that you have there come up and read stuff. Are you seeing? I mean, I know you see all the gambit, right? But
is always an adventure.
Yeah, are you seeing people whose work is speaking to larger things going on in society, or?
Oh yeah, definitely. I do notice the phenomenon that Daniel, your nonfiction is about, that sort of like fascination with trauma in my students. So I have a lot of conversations with students about how we can ethically depict violence. And I do think there is kind of no shortage of trauma media.
Sure.
And I think a lot of my students, like when I ask them what they read or what they listen to, I'm noticing a much higher reportage of true crime. They tell me they love true crime. And that particular genre is a lot of just trauma consumption.
Yeah.
And I am seeing that kind of replicated in my students' fiction.
Yeah.
So we have to have conversations about why we depict trauma, why we depict violence, how you can ethically do that, how you can do that in a way that is not harmful to your audience, and
or like sentimentality, or like manipulating the audience into feeling a certain way.
And you know, I teach at a community college, and so I have like a really wide breadth of students. Like some people are like super beginners who've never written in their life. Some people come to me pretty experienced. But I think that's just like sort of a trend I've noticed, a little kind of uptick in violent, traumatic depictions in my students' work.
I can see that. This might be a hard question. I hope it's not. I always find this type of question hard. What's a book that you can think of that changed your life, and how did it change your life? Your book or poem or short story, like creative piece of writing, and how did it do that? I know, Torfia, you're like a little don't believe in change, but maybe it made an impact on your life. Yeah.
I think personal transformation is possible.
Yeah. That's a great question. Man, do you guys have any answers?
No, whenever anybody asks me for a book that I
Read,
like, my mind goes totally blank, like I've never read a book in my life. It's really weird. 3 in the morning, like 7,000 answers are gonna come to me.
It's probably daunting.
You know, my first thought was, best thought was Earth, Sand, Stars, Earth, Wind, Stars, I think it's called, by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. The guy who wrote The Little Prince. A lot of people don't realize he was a pilot. His nonfiction is amazing. He writes about flight in a way that I think no one's done it better. But at the end of the day, he's a naturalist. He's a guy who's writing about sort of like, you know, he writes about wind the way like people write about the sea and stuff like that. And so there's something kind of really zen and beautiful about that writing, where you're like, oh, this is actually, that's a facet of character too, or that's a facet of the human experience. It's naturalism in the way in which the body moves through the world. And for me, as a writer, that was like a huge light bulb. That I used to fly, I used to be a pilot, so for me that was like, oh shit, I didn't even, it had never occurred to me to write about that.
Yeah.
You know, so that was,
I think
that really,
Yeah. That's really good.
Patricia Smith's Blood Dazzler. It's about Hurricane Katrina, and it personifies the hurricane, but also takes up personas of different people who were involved, and it engages with news and like real events.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking and very difficult to read, but beautiful. And I think just something like we were talking about how poetry can sort of uniquely capture things. I think Blood Dazzler is a beautiful example of how poetry engages with real events.
Yeah.
And talks about them in a way that I have not seen other genres capture that particular event.
No ideas. Yeah.
I was thinking about you bringing up a book you read kind of in younger years made me think of how much of an impact A Wrinkle in Time had on me. I read that book like 10,000 times. I still read it as an adult every couple of years. But I think because it's sort of like, you know, like I think Meg was an introvert, so I was like, I get it, yes. And then there's sort of like, I think like some of her, some of the qualities that she kind of despised in herself, like end up being the ones that she's able to kind of deploy to like, you know, save her father, and like, you know, help save her brother and all of that stuff. And so, I don't know, and that book also had poetry in it. So I think, and also there was like some science, you know, like this idea of kind of like, tesseracting. I will never forget the ant and the like piece of thread. And yeah, so like I just think like time travel and stuff is awesome.
Yeah.
I have not seen the movie.
I haven't either.
I can't like it's like
Don't
I'm
ruin
like
it for
a
yourself.
total corny book reader.
Yeah.
Like I just there's certain books that I can't.
Yeah.
I can't do it. But I like but my second book came out the same day that movie came out, and I was like,
I have an excuse not to go. Yeah, or see all the stuff. Yeah.
yeah. I was just moved that it was like the same day. It's one of my favorite. Yeah.
If I can just share one.
Yeah.
There's this anthology called Mixed. I didn't have an answer to this question, so when I asked y'all, I was thinking of myself. There's an anthology called Mixed, and I read it and I stumbled across it in grad school, I guess in the library, and it was just a collection of short stories by all mixed writers of different mixed identities, and I'm mixed, and at the time, this sounds crazy, I knew I could write about my Mexican side, I knew I could write about my white side, I didn't realize I could write about my mixed side, because I literally had not read one book or story until I was probably 21, I was probably 21 at the time, and just going like, I can do that? That's an option for me? Like, and people would read it, there's a collection of it, so I remember that book really changed my life too, yeah.
Check that out.
Yeah. But we have a little time. If anybody has any questions for our authors on the topic or just writing in general, you're more than welcome to ask.
The scary thing is like when the authors ask you questions and be like, hey,
Yeah.
where'd you get that shirt? I've seen that happen.
Right.
I've seen that happen at a reading once where like a table got turned.
I love that. Well, if we don't have any questions, I just want to say thank you for all being here. Thank you for Whose Books for hosting us and writing workshops, and the Writers Garret for being our partner. And I hope everybody that's watching us comes by Whose Books and buys these authors' books. So thank you.